debate afterwards. I'm Anne Kerry, I'm Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, and I'm delighted to see so many people here today from outside the university as well as within. But without more ado, I'll pass on. You can see I've got my minders with me. I'll pass on first to John Williams from the Southampton
Amnesty Group, yes. You've got to wait 2 more minutes for the main Can I welcome you on behalf of Southampton Amnesty Group? And I just want to tell you something, two little things about Southampton Amnesty Group. It's a very auspicious year for the Southampton Amnesty Group this year. It's our 50th anniversary. So the Southampton Amnesty Group has been running almost as long as Amnesty itself has been running. So we're having a birthday party in June. And we still meet very regularly, once a month on the second Monday of a month down in the community room here in Sainsbury's down in Portswood. So anybody is welcome at 7:30, second Monday of the month. Okay. Let me also thank Anne and her colleagues, and in particular, although I don't know she's in the room at the moment, Tracy Story, who is the person who does all the organisation behind these events. This is our 4th annual joint annual lecture. It started with when Claire Light, my Era, and I were weeding our gardens one summer's afternoon, and we were chatting over the fence, and we thought this would be a good idea, and that was about 4.5 years ago. So, so the deal is that the university does all the organisation, and I find the speakers. So that's not a bad deal. It's quite good. Okay. And I also want to thank, at the start, I want to thank Peter for coming along tonight, Peter Tatchell coming along tonight to give tonight's lecture. Thank you very much for coming down from London. And so now I'm going to hand over to Professor Jeremy Howells, who's tonight's chair.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Business and Law, but more importantly, I'm the university's Equality and Diversity Champion. So I welcome everybody here from the university, from Southampton Solar, from the hospital, from Amnesty International, from Peter Simmons College, anywhere else. People off the street, which is ideal. So I've got 4 words to describe Peter. The first one is radical. Going right back to the late 1970s, he's been archetypically a radical person out there fighting social injustice. That is a real key element that we need to retain in our society. Secondly, he's bold. In everything he does, I think he champions his cause in a very forthright manner, and I really respect that. Associated with that, I would also say he's very brave. In my mind, I can always visualise 1999 in Zimbabwe, where you tried to do a citizen's arrest on Mugabe.
In London.
In London, in London. And his henchmen really tried to get at you. I think subsequently you've had fracas in Russia. Where else?
Paris.
The other places.
Brussels.
So I think he's a genuinely brave person out there putting forward his notions and ideas. And lastly, I would say you're prophetic. I think you really challenge beliefs and cultures in our society in a way that is integral to your own beliefs and systems that you've really retained right through your career, if you could call it a career. And we need these people. They're very rare, so we should value them. I'm not going to use the word national treasure because that's disastrous, but genuinely, he is a key person that we must support and listen to above all. So, over to you, Peter. I understand you're going to talk for about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we'll have questions from the audience. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for that exceedingly generous introduction. More than I deserve, but I appreciate the sentiments. Let me reiterate my thanks to Southampton University and to the Amnesty Group for organising and hosting tonight's meeting. It's a great honour to deliver the Human Rights Lecture 2014, to follow in the footsteps of many other fine previous guest speakers. I chose as my theme tonight the unfinished battle for LGBT rights in Britain. And of course, my starting point is to acknowledge the huge progress that has been made. The lecture is about the unfinished battle, but quite a lot of it has already been finished. And it has been a truly amazing, extraordinary period over the last decade or so to see so many anti-LGBT laws progressively reformed and replaced by new protections which never previously existed. We've gone from being one of the most reactionary countries in Western Europe on LGBT rights to being in the forefront of one of the most progressive West European countries. Indeed, one of the most progressive countries in the world when it comes to LGBT equality. And in the process of achieving that, not only have we ensured equal human rights for LGBT people, we have also made Britain, I believe, a kinder, more liberal, tolerant, compassionate society for everyone. That's a gain for us all. By challenging prejudice against LGBT people, we've challenged lots of orthodoxies. We've got people to think about and question things they've taken for granted, things that were wrong that previously had just been accepted. So we've made Britain a more liberal, tolerant society, and that's a gain for everyone, regardless of sexuality or gender identity. Let's just recap briefly. Until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. Of any country in the world in history. Many of them dating back centuries. We think of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and so on. None of these countries had the breadth of anti-gay laws that Britain once had. People think that male homosexuality was decriminalised or even legalised in England and Wales in 1967. The reality is, it certainly wasn't a legalisation. It was a partial, limited decriminalisation. All the anti-gay laws remained on the statute books. It's just that in certain narrow circumstances, they were not enforced. But still, most aspects of gay male life remained criminalised. As I said, under laws that often went back centuries. So when you look at it in that context, you can see what an enormous sense of satisfaction and achievement we feel when we look at the legal landscape today for LGBT people. It is a completely different country, a better country for all of us. When you think about from 1999, we've had this huge wave of law reform, including ending the ban on LGBT people serving in the armed forces, the equalisation of the age of consent, the repeal of Section 28, the end to the ban on fostering and adopting by same-sex couples, workplace protection to outlaw discrimination in employment, the provision of equal protections against discrimination in the provision of goods and services, such as hotels, restaurants, and so on. We've seen the introduction of civil partnerships, and of course, more recently, same-sex marriage. So this has been a phenomenal pace of change. What we do need to really remember is that the criminalisation of male homosexuality in England and Wales only ended in 2003. The Sexual Offences Act of 2003 finally ended the criminalisation of male homosexuality. Up until that point, as I said, all the historic anti-gay laws remained on the statute books under the heading of, quote, unnatural offences. That was only repealed 11 years ago. What laws am I talking about? I'm sure you're all familiar of the persecution of Oscar Wilde, jailed in 1895 for 2 years hard labour, which effectively killed him. He was convicted under the gross indecency law of 1885, a law that criminalised any kind of sexual contact between men other than anal intercourse. That law was only repealed in 2003. The law on anal intercourse, the so-called law against buggery, passed in the reign of King Henry VIII in 1533, was only repealed in 2003. And all the other laws, people don't realise, and many people don't realise, that until 2003, if two men met each other on the street, or even merely smiled at each other or made some kind of gesture to indicate an interest, that was a criminal offence punishable by up to 2 years imprisonment. It was called soliciting or importuning for an immoral purpose. Now, of course, for a heterosexual couple, boy meets girl on the street or at the supermarket checkout or at school or wherever, it's perfectly natural. You fancy someone, you go up and talk to them, you exchange names and phone numbers. But until 2003, if two men did that, they could face a maximum penalty of 2 years imprisonment. Simultaneously, despite the partial legalisation of 1967, which of course was only extended to Scotland in 1980 and to Northern Ireland in 1982, but under that legislation, any facilitation, encouragement, or aiding and abetting of a homosexual act, even in certain circumstances, a lawful homosexual act, remained a crime. So, for example, until 2003, if I had invited my two friends from Manchester, who had been together for almost 50 years, if I invited them to come and stay at my flat in London, and if I had a spare room and I invited them to stay in the spare room, in the spare bed, knowing that they were likely to have sex, both they and I would be committing a criminal offence. I would be aiding and abetting a homosexual act, and they would be having sex in a premises where more than two people were present. Because under the 1967 Act, it stipulated that homosexual sex was only not prosecuted if it took place between two men aged 21 or over, in the privacy of their own home, with the doors locked, the curtains drawn, and no other person present in any part of the house. So all gay and bisexual male students, typically living in houses of multiple occupation, were committing crimes, as were their flatmates. They may have had sex in the privacy of their bedroom, even with a lock on the door, but if their friends were in the other bedrooms, or in the kitchen or the living room, they were committing a criminal offence, as were their friends, by allowing a sexual act to take place in such circumstances, because that was not deemed to be, quote, private. So you can see, these are just a snapshot of some of the anti-gay laws that existed until just 11 years ago. As I said, it is a stupendous achievement that so many different laws have been repealed in such a short space of time since 1999. It is, I think, probably the fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history, if not world history. I can't think of any country, and certainly no period in our history, where so many laws affecting a minority community have been repealed in such a short space of time. So that's a real tribute to the many tens of thousands of people, LGBT and our much valued straight allies, who marched and walked and protested, who lobbied and campaigned and emailed to get these changes. It was not done by me or Stonewall or anybody else alone. It was a huge collective effort, which shows, I think, the power of the people. When people decide something is wrong and needs to change, if you organise, you can change it. And when we began organising, I can only speak, I only began in the late 60s, but when we began organising, it was a very, very small minority marginal viewpoint. Very, very few supporters. You couldn't get a debate in Parliament in the 1970s or 80s on homophobia and gay rights because MPs, the majority of MPs, regarded it as totally dishonourable and shameful that the Houses of Parliament should even discuss this filthy, vile issue. That was the scale of homophobia. So, it is a real achievement to have made these changes. But of course, there is still unfinished business, which I now would like to address. Perhaps the most obvious issue to look at is the recent introduction of same-sex marriage, which many people have, with good intention, mistakenly described as equal marriage or marriage equality. In fact, laudable though it is, it's no such thing. Same-sex marriage is not equal marriage. We now have legal segregation in marriage law. We have the 1949 Marriage Act, which is for opposite-sex couples, and then separately and distinctly, we have the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act 2013. These are two different marriage laws. Not one marriage law for all, two different separate laws. And separate is not equal. Separate is not equal. The other issue, of course, is that the Same-Sex Marriage Act replicates, in particular, the pension inequalities that have existed in civil partnerships since they were introduced in 2005. This means that in the case of a same-sex married couple, if one partner dies, their surviving partner will not be able to inherit the same amount of their pension contributions as they would if they were a married heterosexual couple. So a married heterosexual couple can inherit the pension accruements if one partner dies. The surviving partner can inherit that pension entitlement. But when it comes to same-sex marriage, and indeed same-sex civil partnerships, the entitlement only goes back by law to 2005, even if the deceased partner may have been paying to their pension for 10 or 20 years. So a very grave injustice there for surviving same-sex marriage spouses. There are four other aspects of discrimination in the Same-Sex Marriage Act. One is the so-called spousal veto, which affects trans people in marriages or wishing to marry, or people in marriages who wish to have a gender transition. Their partners have a right to veto that. And the other big obstacle and inequality is that there is a specific prohibition on the Church of England and the Church of Wales conducting same-sex marriages, even if they wish to. So even if the Church of England or the Church of Wales decide this year, next year, sometime, that they want to conduct same-sex marriages, the law says they are prohibited from doing so. And that is not only homophobic, it's also an attack upon religious freedom. It's saying the churches do not have the right to decide. So that's a leftover issue that we also have to address in years to come. Many of you will know that just recently the government has concluded its consultation on the future of civil partnerships. This consultation asked the public 3 options. The first was to completely abolish civil partnerships and to force existing civil partners to convert to marriages even if they don't want to. The second option would be to retain existing civil partnerships but prohibit any new ones, so leaving existing civil partners in a limbo land. And the third option is to keep civil partnerships and extend them to all couples. So in other words, to end the current ban on opposite-sex civil partnerships. A heterosexual couple cannot by law have a civil partnership. And that is quite clearly a form of discrimination based on sexual orientation, and I've always argued that it's wrong. If you did not participate in the government consultation, it's now closed, but I would still advise and urge you to lobby your Member of Parliament to urge him or her to write to the Equalities Minister, Helen Grant, who's in charge of this public consultation, to write to her on your behalf, urging that civil partnerships be retained and they be opened up to opposite-sex couples. If we can get lots of letters in, although it's out of the window of public consultation, still that will impact on the government. As you know, just this weekend it's been revealed that David Cameron has reiterated his opposition to straight equality. David Cameron says he does not believe that heterosexual couples are entitled to equal rights when it comes to civil partnerships. He says this is a threat and an attack upon marriage. But I disagree, because in essence, civil partnerships are marriage-like. They are similar to marriage. They embody the same principles of love, commitment, stability, fidelity. So I don't see how giving heterosexual couples the right to have a civil partnership in any way undermines existing heterosexual marriages. I don't think for one moment that the vast majority of heterosexual couples are going to choose a civil partnership. So marriage will still be the major institution. But what we do know from some evidence is that quite a lot of LGBT and straight couples don't like the sexist patriarchal history of marriage. They would prefer a civil partnership. For them it's more egalitarian, more modern. And why shouldn't they have that choice? Even if it's only 10 or 15% of heterosexual couples who choose a civil partnership, which on the Dutch projection is probably what it's going to be, even if it's only 10 or 15%, that 10% or 15% have a right to choose. They have a right to make that choice. I think it's wrong for the government to prescribe that marriage is the only way that heterosexual couples can secure legal recognition and rights. They should have the choice, as LGBT couples do, a civil partnership or a marriage. And of course, it is somewhat ironic that today, since the passage of the Same-Sex Marriage Act, same-sex couples have 2 options. A marriage or a civil partnership, whereas straight couples only have 1 option, marriage. For the first time in British legal history, LGBT people have a legal advantage. Not that I'm proud of that. I want to see equality for straight couples. And I think we do need to stand by the principle of equality. David Cameron, after all, when he was asked why he supported same-sex marriage, he said it's a simple matter of equality. Well, if that's true, then that same equality principle applies to civil partnerships, and they should be opened up to straight couples as well. So please do lobby your MP, or indeed your member of the European Parliament. Letters from elected representatives to Helen Grant, the Equalities Minister, they will all help. You can always go to the website writetothem.com, writetothem.com. It'll ask you to put in your postcode. It will then tell you who your member of Parliament is and who your members of the European Parliament are, and you can email them direct from that website. And of course, once you've done one little draft letter to your MP, then you could copy it and just change the name and write to all of your 8 MEPs as well. And even if only 2 or 3 of them write to Helen Grant, it will have an impact. So it's not too late to take a stand for the principle of equality for our straight friends and allies. The other issue of unfinished business is that although we have all these fantastic new equality laws, outlawing discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in the workplace, prohibiting discrimination in the provision of goods and services, and so on and so on and so on, although we have these great laws, every single one of them has written into them limited qualified exemptions for faith organizations. Not just places of worship like churches, mosques, synagogues and temples, but for faith-run bodies like hospitals, schools, nursing homes, shelters for the homeless and so on. In certain circumstances, if they can justify that it conflicts with their ethos, they are allowed to discriminate in employment and in the provision of services to clients. Now, I disagree with people of faith. I'm not religious myself, but I defend absolutely their right to hold their point of view. What I disagree with is their right to discriminate. And that's what the law currently says. The law says people of faith have a right to discriminate. And I think that's wrong. I think in a democratic society, we should all be equal before the law, with the same rights and the same responsibilities. And that should apply to people of faith as well as to people without faith. So that's unfinished business that also needs to be addressed. Now, we still have a major epidemic of homophobic and transphobic bullying in our schools. The statistics indicate that somewhere just over 50% of LGBT kids say they suffered bullying at school, ranging from teasing, name-calling, right through to threats, menaces, and actual physical assaults in the classroom and in the school playground. Now that is just absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong that that goes on. And what is particularly shocking is that despite these statistics, only about half of all schools in Britain today have anti-bullying programs that specifically address homophobic bullying, and hardly any have any programs that specifically address transphobic bullying. So quite clear there's a mismatch between the reality of bullying and action against it. And sadly, there is some anecdotal evidence which appears to indicate that homophobic bullying and transphobic bullying is worse in faith schools, and faith schools do even less to tackle it. I understand the Church of England, as a result of this pressure and shaming, is about to launch a new program to address homophobic and transphobic bullying in schools, which I commend, but it's taken them a very, very long time. And they've had to be pressured and shamed into acting. We also know that as a result of this bullying, the rates of depression, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, and even actual suicide are much higher among LGBT teenagers than the general teenage population. Somewhere between a third and a half of all LGBT kids have at some point suffered from depression and suicidal thoughts as a result of the bullying or ostracism they've suffered at school. And so that really is an issue which a responsible education authority needs to address, to make sure that schools are a safe, welcoming place for all pupils, including those who are LGBT. One of the things I've long argued for is that schools should introduce a program of equality and diversity lessons in a bid to challenge not just homophobia and transphobia, but indeed all forms of prejudice, racism, misogyny, and so on. I think from the first year of primary school and continuing each year throughout a pupil's life, equality and diversity lessons can be a really effective way to help challenge prejudice and nip it in the bud. Because we know that young people are not born bigoted, they become bigoted because of negative influences by adults around them or by their peers. So if education can encourage young people to understand and accept difference, can be welcoming to people of diverse cultural and lifestyle backgrounds, then I think we stand a much bigger chance of not only reducing homophobic and transphobic bullying, but also producing adults who in their later lives are accepting of those who are different from them. Another issue of unfinished business is the way in which LGBT refugees are treated by the asylum system. People fleeing horrendous anti-LGBT persecution in countries like Russia, Uganda, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Iran, and many, many other countries. These are often people who've been arrested, perhaps tortured and jailed. Perhaps there have been attempts to have them killed, either by state authorities or by vigilantes. In some cultures, there's the honor killing, or so-called honor killing, of LGBT people. These refugees have come to Britain to seek a place of safe haven. They've come here in the hope that they can escape the violence and threats that they have suffered in their home countries. And what do? Often as not, we put them in an asylum detention centre, which is, to all intents and purposes, a prison by another name. They can't leave the facility. They have very limited access to their solicitors. They certainly don't have the capacity to prepare their asylum cases behind bars. They've got no way of meeting and taking statements from potential witnesses or going and getting police reports to verify their claim of arrest in their home country. They can't do any of this. They're locked up. These are people who've often escaped a jail, and they come to Britain and they're put in a jail, or at least a jail-like institution. So there's a big, big issue there. And this, of course, not only applies to LGBT refugees, it applies to all asylum seekers. This is the way we are treating people. Driven by the prejudice and bigotry of the UKIP and Daily Mail, we're treating people who've suffered enormous pain. We're treating them like criminals. In fact, in an asylum detention centre, a person detained there has fewer legal rights than someone charged with murder or rape. They are wholly dependent on the legal aid system, which has been cut to shreds by successive governments. Nowadays, it's impossible for any refugee or their solicitor to prepare a proper asylum claim with the limited money that's available. It just isn't possible with the funds available to get witness statements, to get the evidence from the home country, from the police and prison authorities, to get statements in the home country from family and friends, to get medical reports to attest and verify torture. It's impossible. Some solicitors, of course, do succeed in reapplying and getting additional grants to cover this, but it's incredibly difficult. And of course, the government's made it more difficult because many of the people who are put in detention are put in a system called Fasttrack, where they have about 10 to 14 days to first of all make their claim and to appeal an adverse decision. No one can prepare a proper asylum claim in 10 to 14 days, let alone an appeal as well. So the fast-track system is deliberately designed to fail as many refugees as possible, including LGBT ones. It's deliberately rigged to get as many people back out of the country. It's not based upon genuinely assessing individual cases on their merit and on the evidence. It's designed to get as many people as possible to fail. And indeed, if you look at first applications, the failure rate for all refugees is pretty high, but it's exceptionally high for LGBT refugees because there's great prejudice within the asylum system from Home Office barristers and from adjudicators. Some of it intentional, some of it just by ignorance. There is now some training for asylum workers in LGBT issues. But it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work. I have on many occasions heard a Home Office barrister or an asylum adjudicator say to a very masculine-looking man, "You don't appear to be gay to me." Or to a very petite, feminine woman, "You don't look like a lesbian." Actually, it didn't quite use those words, but that was the intention, or that was the gist of what he was saying. So there's very stereotyped assumptions. Also, of course, if a lesbian has been married and has children, that will be counted against her as evidence that she's not really gay, ignoring the fact that in so many cultures, the family pressure, the religious pressure, the community pressure is so great that many women who are genuinely lesbian feel pressured and forced into marriage against their wishes. Until 2010, the government used to say, "Oh, I accept that you've been persecuted. I'm very sorry that you were jailed and tortured, but I think it would be possible for you to go back to your home country and behave with discretion." Behave with discretion. They never tell that to political refugees, ethnic refugees, or religious refugees. They used to say that to LGBT refugees. Go back and behave with discretion. And what did that mean? The presumption was that they should go back to the home country, change their name, move to a part of the country where no one knows them, and then cease all same-sex activity. Then the Home Office would say, "No one will know you're gay, and then you won't be persecuted." Well, thanks to a High Court judgment in 2010, this was ruled illegal. The High Court ruled it was unreasonable to expect an LGBT person to go back and hide their sexuality, to not have sex and to not have relationships. That to have a sexual and emotional life was a human right. So, having lost that argument, the tactic now by the government, Home Office, the asylum system, is to dispute the sexuality of people who are claiming asylum based on sexual orientation or indeed gender identity. Even if they present photographs of themselves and their partner, on holiday together, joint bank accounts, love letters, email exchanges, they'll be told this is all an elaborate hoax set up to convince the authorities that you are gay. This is not genuine, this is a fix. With those who are involved in LGBT activism, they are being told they're only doing LGBT activism to get asylum. They're trying to use LGBT activism as a way of proving their sexuality, that it's all a phony setup. So, for example, I work with a group of Ugandan refugees who have a group called Out and Proud, which is involved in lots of campaigning about LGBT rights in Uganda, but also supporting the equal rights struggle here in Britain. They were involved, for example, in the same-sex marriage campaign. And time again, their members are being told, you're only doing this to get asylum. This is a ploy to get asylum. So what's happening in desperation is that increasingly LGBT refugees are now photographing or actually filming themselves having sex with their partners. And this is a shocking expectation because many of these people come from deeply conservative cultures where any kind of physical display of nakedness, let alone actual sexual acts, is regarded as deeply shameful. But they're driven by desperation to do this. Even then, that doesn't work always. There was a case last year where a man produced a video and photograph of himself having sex with his male partner. And the response from the asylum worker, the official, was to say, "You're faking it. This is a picture of him being anally penetrated by his partner. Because he didn't have an erection, it was deemed that he wasn't really gay." I mean, just the mind boggles. the mind boggles. It just shows the utter immorality to which our asylum system has descended. Completely and totally at odds with any democratic or humanitarian values, in complete violation of our obligations under the Refugee Convention. So that's where we're at the moment. We are challenging these judgments or these interpretations, and eventually I'm sure there will be another High Court ruling that will declare them illegal. But in the meantime, people are being forced onto planes and sent back. And as you know, many of them are badly maltreated by security guards who force them onto planes. They get physically beaten up. I'm sure you know there's been 1 or 2 people who have actually died as a result of abuse by security guards putting them on planes. It's really, really, really shocking to think that our country would treat people this way. Another unfinished business is, of course, the scale of homophobic and transphobic hate crimes. Even today, about a third of all LGBT people report that they have suffered some kind of hate crime. It may just be abuse and insults, but in many instances, it also includes actual physical violence. Actual physical violence based on prejudice against someone because of their perceived sexuality or gender identity. Again, it is astonishing and shocking to think that people in this country, some people in this country, still believe it's okay to go around abusing and threatening and even physically assaulting someone because of their gender identity or their sexuality. Now, of course, the good news is it's much less than it used to be. When I was campaigning in the 1980s, the figure for actual physical violence was, I think, 25% of lesbians had experienced actual physical violence, and just over a third of gay and bisexual men had experienced actual physical violence. Now it's gone down in terms of the level of physical violence, but still the level of overall hate crime is unacceptably high. Another issue is, of course, the unequal interpretation and enforcement of the law. I mean, it's great to have good laws, and I welcome them, but there's a big issue about how they're interpreted and how they're enforced. What's on the statute books and what actually happens in reality can be two different things. I'll give you just 2 examples. The first is the example of the Jamaican reggae and dancehall singers, people like Buju Banton, Elephant Man, Sizzla, Capleton, and so on. Beginning around the period 2004, they put out a series of songs advocating the killing of LGBT people, urging that gay people should be shot, hanged, burned, and drowned. These records were played by the BBC. BBC Radio was playing these records. It took a 10-year campaign to stop it. A 10-year campaign to stop it. These artists would perform at concerts in London and other cities, and the police would do nothing. Now, I remember around the same time, I heard that the neo-Nazi rock band Screwdriver was planning to hold a concert near Waterloo in South London. And I informed the police, and so did other people. The police immediately banned the concert on the grounds that they had a history of racism and that their concert would not be conducive to public order and good community relations. Now, Screwdriver, as far as I know, never advocated killing anyone. They were racist bigots, but they never advocated killing anyone. Whereas these 8 Jamaican dancehall and reggae stars were actually urging the killing of other human beings who happened to be LGBT. And the police did nothing. In fact, the police protected their concerts against protests. Complete double standards. Someone makes a racist quip or remark, they're prosecuted. Someone incites the murder of LGBT people, the police and prosecutors look the other way. Give you another example. Some of you may recall the case of Sheikh Abdullah al-Faisal, who I think around about 10 years ago advocated the murder of Jews, Hindus, and Americans. He was promptly arrested, taken to court, convicted, and jailed for 9 years. 9 years in jail. Around the same time, Imam Abdul Muhid said almost identical things, only this time he said, kill homosexuals. He wasn't even taken to court. There were 4 witnesses who volunteered to testify what they'd heard him say. He was not even taken to court. Again, complete double standards. Now, I'm not saying that all police and all prosecutors are like that. Things are getting much better. And nowadays there are many police forces around the country and many Crown Prosecution Service caseworkers who will prosecute in these cases. But still every now and then we find cases where they don't. And that really, really is wrong. So there's a few examples of the unfinished business. We have, as I said, made great progress. And that's a cause for great celebration. But there is still work to be done. And I hold to my motto, which is keep dreaming the dream of what society could be. Don't accept society as it is. Dream of what society could be, and then help make homophobia and transphobia history. Thank you.